What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG, Magic cards, all that stuff. You know by now. And hard to believe fact here, but did you know that it's already been like 2 months since Zendikar Rising came out? Time flies, right? I mean, we had some bannings. It's kind of rough stuff there for a second, but since then, the meta's really been developing well. You know, there's tons of viable decks in the meta at this point, and that means it can be kind of tough to navigate the format, know what's good, what's not, but I've done a lot of the work for you. Don't worry, because it's time again. It's time again for your favorite video, the standard tier list for Zendikar Rising Standard. As usual, I've mashed together as much data as I could find to determine this tier list, and there's a lot of it out there thanks to sites like MTG Melee open on this monitor. MTG Goldfish is good for aggregating the standard meta, and maybe the best resource I've recently found, mtgmeta.io, which is open on this monitor and shows the matchup charts for pretty much every relevant deck in standard. Links in the description for all this information if you haven't peeped any of this yet or you didn't know these sites existed. They are very valuable resources when determining what decks are the best in the format at any given time. Now, there are 11 decks that we're going to talk about today that I think constitute Tier 1, Tier 1.5, and Tier 2 in Standard at the moment. But don't worry, if net decking or whatever you call it isn't really your bag, the next video I'm going to put out on the channel is going to be the best 8 Rogue Brews in Standard. Don't get confused, not tribal rogues decks that play cards with the creature type rogue. Not like home brews that have had a lot of success in Standard as of the last few weeks. We're going to be talking about those in the next video, but today if you want some meta knowledge, you know, even if you're not somebody that likes to build decks that you find off the internet, this is still a valuable resource to know what you're going to go up against and what you should build your decks for accordingly. As usual, I'll start from the bottom and kind of work my way up to the best decks in Standard, but we're starting at what is effectively C tier or again Tier 2 in this environment, and I think the worst deck, I guess, in Tier 2, the first deck I want to talk about today, again, sort of our honorable mention for the day, is still cycling, whether it's Boros or 4-color cycling or just Jeskai cycling, Lurrus as the companion, all that. You've seen this deck before. You know, Tour de France has been a real deck in the format for months and months now. Really ever since Ikoria came out, and this deck still plays pretty much the same list you've seen before. Zenith Flare, Draenith Stinger, Flourishing Fox, Valiant Rescuer, all the same cards are still in the deck, and there has been some innovation. I've seen Fiend Artisan in this deck from time to time, but for the most part, this is still effectively the same deck that you've known for a few months now, but it still does have really good best of one presence and really good best of one stats as well. Last I checked, this deck was about 70% in the best of one environment, and it does have some pretty good matchups. You know, decks like ESPER YORION, this is very good against, and that's good because YORION is one of the better decks in the format. We'll definitely talk a lot about that one today, but it's also good against decks like TEMUR Ramp, RAKDOS Ramp, or Big RAKDOS, people are calling it, which is actually a better deck than you think, and we'll get to it very soon. Things like Mono Red, it's not so good against, you know, RAKDOS KROXA, it's about 50-50 with, so there are some 50-50 and bad matchups, but some of the decks that it's good against are some of the better decks in the format. That said, it has actively bad matchups against both Rogues and DIMIR control and pretty much any deck that plays counter spells, because Zenith Flare is kind of how you're going to win the game 9 times out of 10. So if your opponent does have access to counter spells, cycling becomes a much worse game plan, but you can still win off of Stingers and Valiant Rescuers some of the time. It's not too hard to do, and again, the deck is very good when you don't get to sideboards. I'm not going to look at best of one too much today in determining where these decks go on the tier list, but cycling is a deck that not only is demonstrably good in best of one and has traditionally been for the last few months, but is also a deck that in best of 3 can do some work from tournament to tournament, and it has a few, you know, 6-2 or 7-1 results on MTG Melee. So it's definitely a deck you have to look out for, especially if you're playing Arena as like your main Magic playing experience. Cycling's a deck that you're going to have to be prepared for. But let's get into what is effectively the number 10 deck that occupies the middle of the C tier here, and that's Golgari Adventures, a deck that was pretty hot towards the beginning of the format, but has begun to wane a good bit in popularity. On MTG Goldfish, this only has about 1% of the meta right now, which is not a very good showing, but on MTG Melee, it's the number 9 deck in the format in terms of how often it's played. If you go into the stats on MTG Melee, it's not a very winning deck, but if you look at mtgmeta.io, the deck obviously has good matchups and bad matchups, which is what I'm going to be talking about a good bit today. But if you just want to look at some of the key cards in this deck, you've got things like Edgewall Innkeeper, the Great Hinge, Murderous Rider, and Lovestruck Beast. Again, kind of all the stuff that you're used to being in Golgari Adventures when it was first a deck, like a year ago when Eldraine first came out. Now, the thing about Golgari Adventures is I think that it's getting a little bit more popular, or at least it was more popular after the bannings, because now that Lucky Clover isn't a card, TEMUR Adventures isn't as attractive, and Murderous Rider is more attractive. Murderous Rider was never too good with Lucky Clover because sometimes you're going to hit yourself for 4 damage or even 6 damage. There are times where Murderous Rider is not even castable if you have a Lucky Clover out. And that led to a lot of people being nervous to play Rider alongside Lucky Clover. And so Black wasn't really played too much in adventure decks. But now you don't have Lucky Clover, you don't have to worry about technically. It was definitely a good kind of problem to have. But, you no longer have that wrinkle to worry about. So Murderous Rider becomes a much better card. And so you see a lot more Black in these adventures decks. Ultimately, I think that the GRUUL adventure decks are miles beyond the Golgari adventure decks, but if you do really like cards like Murderous Rider, Order of Midnight, and Rankle, for instance, then maybe Golgari Adventures is the deck for you. And it's got some good matchups, too. It's got good matchups against Rogues, famously. That's one of its best matchups. It's at about 56% against DIMIR Rogues. It's good against Mono Red, like, I think very, very good against Mono Red. And also, it's fantastic against the KROXA and KROXA, the TEMUR ramp decks in the format. So it's got, 4 decent matchups, but the bad matchups are all very popular decks as well. Control, DIMIR Control, it's got a bad matchup against, as well as ESPER YORION, something you don't want to have a bad MU with. Mono Green Food, and then the RAKDOS ramp decks. It's also bad against. So kind of high risk, high reward. You're good against popular decks like Rogues, TEMUR ramp and whatnot, but you're pretty bad against other popular decks like YORION and DIMIR Controls. So really pick your poison. It all depends on what you want to lose to, but I think you've got enough bad matchups. The Golgari Adventures is obviously not going to land in B tier, but it's still a playable deck here in tier 2. Now, at the very top of C tier is a deck that I think has the potential to move up significantly, and that's RAKDOS Ramp. In case you haven't heard of this deck, it's an offshoot of the mono red ramp decks that started to gain popularity about 3 weeks or a month ago. This is still the mostly mono red deck that plays Ironcrag Feat to try to get to Ugin on like turn 5. It plays Maze Mind Tome, Solemn Simulacrum, but it added black to often play KROXA, so it's kind of an offshoot of the KROXA decks. But it mostly plays, Bloodchief's Thirst, Heartless Act, and more, efficient black removal, so you can actually take out some of the bigger targets in the format right now. You're not just stuck with red removal. Turned out not to be enough, but if you add black to the deck, you get this whole new dimension that allows you to take out a range of targets, and you get to play KROXA, and that's worth a good bit against matchups like Rogues and whatnot. So RAKDOS Ramp has been a deck that is an up-and-comer, but it hasn't had a whole lot of time to really make its mark yet. Right now, it doesn't even have a rating on MTG Goldfish, but it is the number 10 deck on MTG Melee, and it just doesn't have a whole lot of data to go by, but from what we can tell, it has decent matchups against Rogues and GRUUL, and that right there is a good, metric to go by. If you're good against both Rogues and GRUUL, you're good against 2 of the better decks in the entire format right now, so that's worth taking a look at, but we're also good against the KROXA decks and the Mono Green Food decks, so a pretty good spread of things to be good against there. The problem is that we're bad against the ESPER YORION decks, again, something that you really don't want to be bad against, but you can't beat them all. That said, we also have bad matchups against TEMUR, and we kind of 50-50 with DIMIR Control and with Mono Red Aggro. And 50-50s aren't too terrible, but they are something that I at least want to point out when they're relevant. I think it is here. But again, having the dimension to cast KROXA in the late game or Ugin in the late game is a nice little spread of options to have. In the meantime, you got all the best removal in the format at your disposal. So I really like the cut of this deck's jib, but again, we need more results from it before we can really gauge how good the deck is. So again, I think this one is likely to perhaps move up or move back in the coming weeks after it tries to establish its position a little bit more. But we're moving on up to the B tier here. This is the biggest tier, the most populous tier on the list. Again, if you want to think of this as tier 1.5, go ahead and do that. That's usually how Magic players would refer to this tier. And the first deck that I want to talk about here is RAKDOS KROXA, of all things. Now, this deck has slid a little bit. When Rogues was the most popular deck in the format, this was one of the other most popular decks in the format, when we were all still, working towards TEMUR Ramp, ESPER YORION, GRUUL Adventures, and stuff. RAKDOS KROXA had a much tighter hold on the format because it has such an amazing matchup against Rogues, but that's not its only bad or only good matchup. It's also decent against DIMIR Control, Mono Red. It's good against TEMUR Ramp, so there are a fair amount of decent matchups for this deck. But again, there are bad matchups. We're also bad against ESPER YORION, like every other deck that we've talked about so far. We're not very good against GRUUL, not very good at all, in fact. Mono Green Food can be a tough matchup. And then RAKDOS Ramp, also not the best matchup for a Rakdos KROXA deck, because they do a lot of the same things we do, but they just have a much better later game. You know, they don't play kind of substandard cards like TEMUR calls the dead and whatnot. They play mostly just better cards, you know, but at the same time, we have better, you know, we have good matchups that deck doesn't have. We have bad matchups that deck doesn't have. So, you know, don't be tempted to look at Rakdos Ramp and Rakdos KROXA as the same deck. The only reason that Rakdos KROXA is ahead of it on the list, Rakdos Ramp that is that, you know, we just have more results for Rakdos KROXA. You know, if you look at mtgmeta.io, there's just so many more games to go off of for KROXA, and we know for a fact that it's better against rogues, and that's, again, a very important matchup in the format right now. You just embarrass rogues, but you 50-50 a lot of other stuff, and your bad matchups aren't that bad, except for the gimmies against YORION. Moving up to number 6, I guess, here. Just sort of, again, the middle of the B tier. But there are 5 decks in tier 1.5 this time around. But we're going to talk about Mono Red Aggro next. And it might be a little controversial to put this deck ahead of Rakdos KROXA. But I like its matchups a little bit more in this current day and age. And I also like it way better in Best of 1, which, again, I'm not weighing too highly. And again, Rakdos KROXA is a very good deck in Best of 1 too. But Mono Red has been the king or queen of Best of 1 for a long time now, and that hasn't really changed too much lately. That said, though, in the regular Best of 3 tournament environment, this is still a very viable deck that has a fair amount of 50-50s against a lot of decks, but I still don't think that it's good enough to be considered one of the best decks in the format, and it has slid a good bit because a few tier lists ago it was the best deck in all of Standard, to my mind. But again, some decks have come along to kind of embarrass it at this point, but it still has good matchups like TEMUR Ramp, you know. We 50-50 Rogues and we 50-50 YORION, and those are very interesting 50-50s. We also just completely demolish like every off-meta deck except for Mardu YORION, a deck that tends to be really good against us, from what the data bears out at least. But just about every other off-meta or deck that's not on this list here, Mono Red just dumpsters. So there's that to worry about too. But, you know, our bad matchups are really bad. We're bad against GRUUL, which kind of does a lot of the things we're doing, but has a lot more dimensions. You know, if you're going to play Mono Red in this format right now, I think you might just rather play GRUUL a lot of the time, which is not a very good, you know, indicator for Mono Red's playability. We're also very bad against food. We're not very good against Rakdos KROXA. So, you know, any deck with a high amount of removal, again, like KROXA, we're just not very good against a lot of the time, even though Mono Red has things like Annex and Phoenix of Ash to kind of get past removal. It still seems like these very removal heavy decks, and decks that play Extinction Event especially, are very good against us. And decks like, you know, GRUUL just outclasses us at every turn. Food gains too much life, and it's kind of too much of a mid-range deck that plays too many big creatures. Again, you know, if they Yorvo on turn 2 thanks to Gilded Goose or something, that just completely destroys our plan for the rest of the game. So some of these mid-rangey decks that play big creatures are good against us, but we can get the jump on these control decks. You know, we 50-50 Rogues or 50-50 YORION, decent matchup against DIMIR control. So, you know, even in the best of 3 environment, Mono Red is still very much a viable deck, but I don't think it's anywhere close to the best deck. But up next, we come to TEMUR Ramp, sort of right in the middle of the tier list here at effectively number 5. Now, TEMUR Ramp is a deck that's a bit of a chameleon because there's a TEMUR Adventures Ramp deck that plays things like Edgewall Innkeeper, Bone Crusher Giant, Beanstalk Giant, Beans. You're familiar with this deck, you know. It often doesn't play Ugin at the top end, but it still will play some things like Shark Typhoon on occasion, right? Genesis Ultimatum is probably the most important card in any version of this deck because both the Adventures deck and the more sort of rampy, control-y TEMUR Ramp deck we'll finish with Genesis Ultimatum a lot of the time. But so far, the more popular and winning version of the deck has been the more sort of control-y, less creature-based deck that still plays the 4 copies of Genesis Ultimatum, but it plays all 4 copies of Ugin as well, 4 copies of Shark Typhoon, and those are its major win conditions. But in the meantime, it'll play cards like Cultivate to sort of round things out. So TEMUR Ramp, very much a best of 3 deck. Not a very good deck in best of 1 if you care about that. But, you know, it's bad matchups are matchups you really don't want to be bad. But at the same time, its good matchups are important too. You know, we're very good against Rakdos Ramp. We're very good against the food decks in the format. So even though those are important matchups, though, they're not the most important matchups. We lose to KROXA. We lose to DIMIR Control. We lose to Rogues. And we lose to GRUUL in most cases at least. And those are really not good matchups to lose in, you know. As far as Yorion, it's about a 50-50, which is a decent proposition, but you really don't want to lose to Rogues and GRUUL and KROXA and DIMIR control. It's just not a very good proposition to me. And even though TEMUR Ramp is a blast to play, when your entire steez revolves around resolving Genesis Ultimatum or Ugin, and there are multiple decks that play counter spells or kill you before you can get to that point in the game, I'm just not super excited by the proposition of Ramp right now. But that said, the results bear out a pretty decent deck with decent game against a lot of different stuff. That 50-50 is important decks, but again, I think that the bad matchups are too plentiful against too many important decks to make this one of the best decks in the format, and I don't think it gets out of B tier. Now, getting a little bit closer to the top of B tier, we're going to talk about Mono Green Food, which is a real up-and-comer here. This deck has only been popular for a few weeks now, but a lot of the results have borne out. You know, in case you haven't seen this deck, it started life as a meme, but it turns out it's actually a deck. In case you haven't seen it, a lot of the, you know, important stuff in the deck revolves around getting a Feasting Troll King into play and then out of your graveyard as quickly as possible, whichever one pertains more to your plan. But the deck obviously uses cards like, you know, Wicked Wolf and Trail of Crumbs and other food-related cards to generate value. And it also uses the Great Hinge. This deck reminds me a good bit of Jund Sacrifice, of all things. And there's even some Jund Sacrifice in the Rogue Brews category on MTG Melee that are effectively a lot like these food decks, but they just like work in Corvold, Faker's King, and like, you know, maybe Claim the Firstborn or something. But for the most part, these sacrifice decks, I mean, it's not a sacrifice deck, it's a food deck, but the sacrifice decks from yesteryear were very much food decks. You know, we use Witch's Oven, Trail of Crumbs, and whatnot. And this is just a spiritual successor to that, but it's a little bit more consistent because it's mono-colored. You don't have to worry about that kind of mana screw anymore. And it's just really good at generating value. The deck isn't incredibly fast a lot of the time, but if the deck does have some time to generate some value, get some food on the table, it's got decent removal in Wicked Wolf, it's got a big, you know, hard to deal with, you know, hard to remove threat in Feasting Troll King. You know, in some ways the deck reminds me of the KROXA deck, but it draws more cards, generates more value thanks to things like the Great Hinge. So the deck has a lot going for it, and if it's allowed to, you know, get on board the way it wants to, then it's really hard to stop, and it can chain together these big turns where it draws a bunch of cards. So, you know, it's a really exciting deck to watch, but you do have to be upfront about its matchups. You know, we have good matchups against Rogues, which is awesome. We have good matchups against Mono Red and KROXA. So those are interesting dimensions, especially the good matchup against Rogues. But as far as the bad matchups, DIMIR Control, TEMUR Ramp is just a better ramp deck than us. RAKDOS Ramp is a better ramp deck than us. Yorion we're about 50-50 with. So the deck isn't too bad, and its bad matchups aren't too much of a pain. Its good matchups are okay, you know, especially the Rogues matchup. But I think we're 50-50 with Yorion, 50-50 with GRUUL. And if you want to flip a coin in those matchups, it's a lot better than having bad matchups. Right? I guess. So, you know, Mono Green Food is a deck that I think not enough people respect. But at the same time, you know, you got a lot of decks now playing Cling to Dust and Scavenging Ooze and other things that can go into the graveyard and mess with your stuff. So Feasting Troll King might not proc as often as you expect it to. The deck might be too slow against GRUUL Adventures a lot of the time to really get online and start doing what it wants to do. So there are definitely a lot of pros and cons with the deck, but again, this deck is very fun to play, and you've never seen a mono green deck generate this much value. And you know, it's not all just a meme either, it turns out. The deck is very serious, and although a lot of people, I think, expect this deck to move up from this position, I think the deck will probably settle in around this position for the rest of the format. But here at the very top of B tier, a very populated B tier, this is the 5th deck, but again, best one in tier 2, and I think the one that is most likely to move up of any tier 2 deck, and that's DIMIR Control. Not quite the Rogues deck, although you do see a lot of, you know, Rogues decks that are labeled DIMIR Control, but they play Soaring Thought Thief and, you know, Thieves Guild Enforcer, they play Lurrus, but more and more nowadays, we're seeing a much more traditional blue-black control deck. You know, the neutralized deck in the format, if you will, but there's other key cards besides just neutralize. We play a lot of efficient black removal, we play Cling to Dust and whatnot to control graveyards and draw cards, gain life and whatnot. But we've also got Ashiok as a good win condition. A lot of these decks will play Ugin at the top end of the curve as is a win condition. Crawling Barrens is a decent win condition in these decks as well. Shark Typhoon, a good win condition too. So, right now, blue-black, not too bad. You can draw cards, you can counter spells, you can kill creatures efficiently, and you've got a pretty decent spread of acceptable win conditions within the DIMIR color combinations. So, DIMIR Control is a deck that we heard rumblings about at the beginning of the format. Maybe we should just cut these rogues and play blue-black. And, eventually people started actually doing that. And the deck has been really good in terms of results, especially here lately in the last couple of weeks where it's really started to move up the ladder and really, contend with DIMIR rogues for its slot. As far as good matchups and bad matchups, we're really good against YORION, and you may notice this is one of the first decks that I've said has a good matchup against ESPER YORION, so it's very, very important. But we're also good against the food decks and the TEMUR ramp decks in the format, and those are all decent matchups. Now, as far as bad matchups, we're about 45% or something, I think it is, against GRUUL, which isn't terrible, but it's definitely much worse than 50-50. And GRUUL is a deck that we really would like to beat, so bad matchup against that is not a good call. But we're also bad against the KROXA decks. We tend to be bad against the RAKDOS ramp decks as well, but there's not a whole lot of matchup data in terms of that matchup. But, KROXA, we can stand to be bad against KROXA. The rogues decks in the format are already kind of throwing that matchup out the window, conceding on turn one to the KROXA decks and kind of beating a lot of other things. We are sort of the same way in a lot of ways as that deck. We have some of the same bad matchups, some of the same good matchups. But if you just desire a more traditional control playstyle, lock the game out, don't have to do all these tricksy mill things or win off of tempo the way Rogues does. I will say these decks are somewhat similar in philosophy, but at the same time, they're not. Again, because Rogues is an aggro, a tempo deck in a lot of ways, whereas this is a much more traditional slow roll control deck. So if that's more your bag, I think that you might as well just play control over the Rogues deck because it's just as viable in a lot of ways. But here we are in the final tier of the day, the A tier. That's right, there's no S tier this time around. There's no Omnath deck. There's no Fires of Invention in its later days. There's none of that stuff. I don't think that there is just a slam dunk best deck in the format. Play this or play nothing else. I don't think we're there, which is a testament to, I was going to say how good Wizards did, but really a testament to what happens when you ban cards like Lucky Clover and Omnath. I think those bans were still a really good move. And although in the past I've said that I wish those bans went a little farther, ban Embercleave, even ban cards like the Great Henge, I think would be fine. But even with the bans that we did get, I think we still ended up with a really well-rounded format here. But if you want the absolute best decks in the format, let's talk about those. What is effectively the number 3 deck in the format right now, to my mind, is DIMIR Rogues, coming up really close in front of DIMIR Control. Again, kind of a different philosophy here. We're obviously more of a tempo deck. We play Thieves Guild Enforcer, Soaring Thought Thief, sometimes Ruin Crab, very often Ruin Crab. We play Lurrus of the Dream Den as our companion. So again, the slots in this deck are very different a lot of the time because you have to spend, 12 slots on creatures, a companion slot on Lurrus and whatnot. So you can't play cards like Ashiok or Ugin or Shark Typhoon. So these are very different decks despite, mine and everybody else's propensity to sort of compare them. And their matchups are different too. GRUUL, as Rogues, has really good matchup against TEMUR Ramp. 50-50's a lot of other stuff. At 50-50's YORION. It has an actively bad matchup against KROXA, bad matchup against Food, bad matchup against RAKDOS Ramp. Any deck that plays KROXA, it's bad against. Apparently, it's bad against the Food deck. That's what MTG Meta IO says, but I haven't really gotten to test that matchup too much. It seems like we would be kind of decent against Food, but I guess that's apparently Control is the good one against Food because you want more counter spells and removal and whatnot, I suppose. But in Rogues, you just don't spend as many slots on cards like that because you actually have to spend slots on threats. Whereas the Control deck doesn't do that. That said, that one good matchup, like the best matchup is TEMUR Ramp. Apparently we just stomped TEMUR Ramp, and I have experienced that before from the standpoint of the TEMUR Ramp player. But at the same time, the matchups like, GRUUL and YORION are really just 50-50s. So we play at least fairly against the other two best decks in the format. We don't play super well against some of the not very popular decks in the format in some ways, and in some ways because those decks were built to beat us. KROXA was kind of built to beat DIMIR Rogues. and is very, very good against it. Again, we just throw that matchup out the window. Whereas we work pretty hard to win the other matchups, and we just stomp out things like TEMUR Ramp. So, interesting deck to play. I don't know that it deserves the pedigree that it's gotten so far in this format, which is why I kind of put it at number 3 in the A tier. But it is still undeniably a good deck that a skilled pilot can win a lot of games with. But the number 2 deck in the format, you've probably been waiting for this one, it's ESPER YORION, ladies and gentlemen. Done a lot of talking about the deck already in the video, without actually talking much about the deck. Now, in case you somehow haven't seen this deck, we play YORION as a companion, although sometimes the deck will just play 4 YORION main deck, but it's far more popular to play the 80-card companion version. But this is effectively a Doom Foretold deck. Sometimes they call it Esper YORION, sometimes they call it Esper Doom Foretold. Titles are effectively interchangeable, so from there, it just plays all the Doom Foretold stuff that you're used to at this point. Treacherous Blessing for refills, a lot of removal, sagas and whatnot, like the Birth of Melodus are very important to this deck, so... Dance of the Manse is a card that some decks play, some decks don't. I think it's in about 65% of Esper YORION decks right now, but it is mostly their late game plan to cast Dance of the Manse, and often decks will play 2 copies of that. So even though these decks are built somewhat differently, you might play Dance, you might not. You might play, Golden Egg, you might not. So far, the list has been getting more and more condensed as the weeks goes on, more and more agreed upon as the weeks go on, and that has lent to, again, a very solid deck in this format. It 50-50s a lot of stuff. I've given the impression that a lot of decks are bad against it, but that's not necessarily the case. Our best matchups, period, are GRUUL and KROXA. That said, we 50-50 with Rogues, and we 50-50 with TEMUR Ramps. So, we have fair matchups against a couple of really popular decks, and we have very good matchups against at least one extremely popular deck. GRUUL AGGRO, that is. Or GRUUL Adventures, whatever you want to call it. We are fantastic against. I think that we have like a 60-something% against GRUUL, which is where you want to be. And if that comes along with the 50-50 against Rogues, absolutely you'll take that all day. There are some Redditors on Spikes, more than one, that think that Esper YORION is kind of on the downswing. People respect it, but they might not necessarily should. I think that's probably a misevaluation. I think Esper YORION is easily one of the best decks in the format and has really good matchups against a lot of stuff, and 50-50 matchups against decks are important to 50-50 against. So, I joked in a video a couple of weeks ago after the bannings that it might finally be time for Esper Doom Foretold, thanks to the fact that we banned nearly every other good card in the format, and it turns out apparently that was the correct assessment. It took a while, but Doom Foretold is finally a very real deck, and it's actually one of the decks that I like to play against the least. I feel a great deal of stress and pressure playing against Doom Foretold, just from my standpoint. I don't know about you, but it's one of the decks that I like to play against the least in the format right now. And that's because, again, it just feels stifling, and a lot of matchups just feel bad against it. Again, this is one of those decks that completely decimates all of the off-meta decks, so you got that too, I just think if you're trying to ladder on Arena or win your F&M or whatever you're doing right now, then Esper YORION is easily one of the better choices you could make. And then finally, the only deck we haven't talked about, you probably figured it out by process of elimination, but the number 1 deck in the format at the moment, to my mind at least, and a lot of other people's minds, is GRUUL Adventures or GRUUL AGGRO, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes this deck will go more all-in on the Adventures half of it, play Edgewall Innkeeper, it always plays Innkeeper, Bone Crusher Giant, Lovestruck Beast, all that. And then other times, the deck will make room for things like Brushfire Elemental and Kazandu Mammoth. But sometimes you won't see Mammoth. Sometimes you won't see Brushfire. You'll especially see Brushfire cut a good bit of the time. But still, these decks are built in somewhat different ways. But, the goal is similar. It started life as really an aggro deck, trying to go as fast as possible. It played more Questing Beast towards the beginning. Again, it played more Brushfire Elemental towards the beginning. But now, we lean a little bit heavier on the Great Hinge. One of the secrets to this deck is that it actually plays the 2 most broken cards that are still available from Throne of Eldraine. And that's Embercleave and the Great Hinge. The deck leverages both of these cards really well, plus it gets access to a bunch of other amazing cards like Bone Crusher, Lovestruck Beast, Edgewall Innkeeper for the card advantage. You've basically got an aggro deck that Also, it feels like a mid-range deck, but the mid-range creatures that it plays are really above curve. You know, Kazandu Mammoth, Lovestruck Beast, Bone Crusher Giant. These are all above-rate creatures that do other stuff. So it feels like a mid-range deck, but it also feels aggro because it's fast. It plays a bunch of creatures quickly. It's got things like Ember Cleave. It feels like an aggro card, but if you have to go late, you can because you're drawing cards off of Edgewall Innkeeper. You're drawing cards off of the Great Henge. So it's kind of an aggro deck that has a really good late game plan, and you just don't see a deck like that very often. This deck approaches the meta from a lot of different dimensions and angles, and it's a deck that I really respect, and is actually the deck that I'm laddering with the most. Right now, it's like this and blue-black control are the things that I'm laddering with the most at this point in time. But GRUUL Aggro is the deck I would recommend, and a lot of other people right now. According to MTG Goldfish, it's got 25% of the meta. 1 out of 4 decks are GRUUL Aggro / Adventures decks. According to MTG Melee, it's the #1 most played deck in the format, and not only that, but here on mtgmeta.io, it has the most favorable matchups of any deck. Although not all matchups are favorable. In terms of good matchups, we're fairly good against slower decks like TEMUR Ramp. We have a good matchup against Rogues because we're very fast. We have a good matchup against Mono Red because we just do everything they do but better. And we have a good matchup against RAKDOS KROXA because, again, while they're playing cards like Mire Triton and Timurrid Calls the Dead, we're playing the best cards in our deck. We also have a better, long game than a lot of these. The long game for decks like KROXA is just play KROXA. that's more or less it. The long game for a deck like TEMUR Ramp is very, very good, right? Get your Great Henge, play Genesis Ultimatum and all that. But in the end, because of our Great Henge and some of the other cards we're playing, we end up having not only a better early game, but a better long game than a lot of other decks in the format. And that is a massive metric when determining if your deck's any good. As far as bad matchups, though, we have a few, like ESPER YORION is our worst matchup in the format right now, and it's not good for that to be a bad matchup. But we're also apparently a little less than 50% against food, and against the big Rakdos deck, we're not very good either. But the thing is that food is slightly popular, but obviously not as popular as Rogues or ESPER YORION. And Big Rakdos is not a very popular deck at the moment at all. So some of our bad matchups we're not too worried about. And even the ESPER YORION matchups, we're not completely throwing out the window. They are winnable with the correct start or stumble by the opponent or whatever. So even those matchups aren't lost completely from, your opening hand or anything. Having a good matchup against Rogues is obviously really important. And TEMUR Ramp is an important deck. Mono Red is an important deck, especially if you do the majority of your playing on Arena. So, right now, GRUUL Aggro, I think, is just easily the best deck in the format without there being this enormous degree of separation between it and the other 2 best decks in the format, to where it belongs in the S tier or they need to ban something or anything. No, it just leverages 2 of the best cards in the format, and extremely well. It can strike quickly, or it can play a more long game. And a deck with that many dimensions is always something you have to worry about. So, it's no surprise to me that GRUUL Aggro is the best deck in the format, but do we need to freak out and do something about it? Absolutely not. I don't think so at all. I think there are a lot of fair matchups against it, and a lot of winnable matchups as well, even with off-meta decks. Now, that's all for the tier list this time around, and I know there were probably some decks that you wanted me to talk about that I didn't talk about. There's the Transmogrify deck that gets a Dream Trawler on turn 4 that looked like it was going to be popular, but hasn't really produced too many results thus far. There are various Jeskai decks in the format, actually, but there's also the Mono White Seasoned Hallowblade Maul of the Skyclaves decks that's kind of a rogue brew right now that's producing some results. There's the Mono Black Lurrus deck that uses, Archfiend's Vessel, Call of the Death Dweller, Village Rites, and all that. So there are some off-meta decks that I'm not going to talk about in the, the Rogues decks video that I'm about to put out after this, but are nonetheless decks that you need to watch out for and have at least some place in the meta. If we were doing a tier 2, 2.5, or a tier D or whatever this video, then some of the decks I've just mentioned would be there. But I really wanted to focus on the absolute most solid decks in the format and kind of do like a top 10 in disguise as a tier list, right? So, just let me know how you felt about all of this and where the placement of all these decks are on the list. But there are some controversial picks on there, so let me know how you felt about it down there in the comments section. Aside from that, it would really help me out if you'd like the video. I obviously put a ton of work into it, as I do every video. So like the video, subscribe for more content like this, plus deck techs, Twitch streams, all that. You can watch me play Magic on Twitch at twitch.tv/SBMTGDev. And if you want to support the channel, reward me for content like this that you obviously enjoy, Then click the Patreon link in the description. Donate $1 a month, and you can vote on what content we do around here. Aside from that, I'm pretty much done. I guess you can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev for takes and whatnot. Aside from that, that's all I got for the tier list video. It's always a fun one to do, and I can't wait to do the Kaldheim tier list and see how things have changed until then. But for now, I got to get out of here and edit this thing because it's going to be a lot of editing. Love you guys. Catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.